So here we are. We're going to talk about World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars. So we need to talk about the causes of World War I. And somebody, I don't know, years ago told me they had learned an acronym in high school, which I guess I never learned. I don't know why. But MAIN, Maine. Okay. I'm not going to tell you those in order because that's not the way I have it set up. But each one of those is going to be a way that can help you, MAIN is going to help you remember what the major causes are. Okay. So MAIN. If you write that down on a sheet of paper while you're listening, you can fill them in as we go because the I is imperialism. Now, imperialism is building nations trying to grab land so you can have more for your country. It's for glory, it's for spreading out, it's for control. It's going to happen from the late 1800s up until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. And the European nations, for the most part, are all going to get in on this. The United States, we're not messing around with going to Africa. We're gonna end up doing our imperialism as far as the Spanish-American War goes. But the nations of Europe are carving up Africa, trying to, again, get glory, prestige, and more land and more consumers as the Industrial Revolution is really revved up by that time. So we see over in the world of poetry, we see a poem by Rudyard Kipling in 1899 called The White Man's Burden. And he's actually writing about the Filipinos and the Philippine War, and that's all part of the whole thing where we had gone and we were taking a lot of the Spanish holdings that were the end of their New World Empire by the late 1800s as we got in with the Spanish-American War, etc. But some people took that poem to help justify imperialism. So in the United States, we had a lot of people who latched onto this phrase, the white man's burden, as, really just a symbol, a euphemism, idiom for imperialism that says, you know what we're doing? We're coming in there, and you have to read that poem. I would suggest you go and Google that poem and just get a quick look at it to understand. But basically, hey, it's a white man's burden to have to spread civilization to these, quote, savages. Okay, and they're trying to make it into this noble thing they're doing is they're civilizing all these people. Again, Kipling was specifically talking about the Filipinos, and there's some interpretation, whatever, but anyway, it is what it is. So imperialism is one of the big causes of World War I. So the second big cause here, if you've got your MAIN written down somewhere, you can fill in the N now, it's nationalism. Okay, nationalism is something that I always describe kind of as patriotism gone bad, patriotism on steroids, where you're not just proud of your country, you don't just love your country, that's patriotism. But when you say that you believe that your nation is above everyone else, your nation, it's kind of like this whole my nation, right or wrong, it's my nation, we're the best, we're the best, we're the best. And so basically every nation is going to start regarding itself as sovereign with no higher authority. They're not thinking about anyone except their own interest, right? So we see this thing called brinksmanship. Brinksmanship is extremely dangerous, and it refers to practice of pushing a dangerous situation up to the brink of disaster. And it reminds me of that game of chicken where you have two guys driving cars toward each other, and the I guess the goal of this game is you don't want to be the guy that swerves first. Now, if neither one of you is a chicken, that could be pretty devastating. But remember, if you do win that game, if you play that stupid game of chicken and you don't swerve, okay, the other guy does, then what do you have? You have bragging rights. Well, you know what? He's the chicken. I'm not the chicken. Well, brinksmanship is this same idea on an international level, which is extremely terrifying, right? So, what happens is you're going to push the other country up to the point where they give in, hopefully, right? Because whoever forces the other guy to give in is going to be able to force the other guy to do some of what they want. Okay, you're going to be able to force your opponent to concede to some of your demands, whatever those demands may be. So nationalism can be extremely dangerous. Okay, we hear a lot about nationalism today, but in this context where you have not just patriotism, but the idea that your country can do no wrong and you should only think of yourself and so on, self-interest and all of that, that's dangerous. It's one of the major causes of World War I. So if indeed you do have your acronym MAIN written down and you're filling it in as I'm talking, here we have the M, militarism. Okay, militarism. So popular militarism, I call it, and that's because it's going to go out to the people. It's going to go out, it's going to be something that is spreading out there into the civilians. Okay, this is going to be the first total war where we end up getting men, women, children, older people. Everyone's going to be involved in one way or another. That's World War One. So most European nations, except Great Britain, begin conscription or the draft. Europe's armed to the teeth, someone said back in the day, by the outbreak of World War One. And again, just like with nationalism, the European countries become convinced that every nation's importance and economy and their status in the world depends on how strong their military is. So at the end of the 1800s, we had seen 1866 Italy mostly unified. We had seen by 1871 Italy completely unified once we got Rome and Venetia. And then also we had seen Germany unified, right? So we're going to see that things had been pretty wild for a while, but then we went into that period of La Belle Epoque from really 1871 up until the outbreak of 1914, which is where we have a great deal of peace and art and impressionism and all that kind of stuff that we talked about. So the armies were not what they concentrated on, but they're going to start concentrating on these armies during this period leading up to World War One. Okay, so again, for a while after 1871, after the Franco-Prussian War, we're not going to see as much of that as we had seen before. But then as we get closer and closer up to 1914, we're going to see all of this competition in making the armies bigger. You're also going to see competition between Germany and Great Britain with the navies. Great Britain is always going to have a great navy because they're an island nation. But again, we're going to see these people arming themselves, building up their armies for something, right? And that something is going to end up being World War One. Here's where we fill in the last part of your MAIN acronym, MAIN. Four causes of World War One. Alliances. Okay, I have a system of alliances, but it's alliances. Okay, so by 1907, we have all these European powers that have signed all these treaties. And basically, they've divided up Europe into two different groups. Okay, we have the Triple Entente during peacetime, before the war starts. They're called the Triple Entente. This is their alliance. And this was made up of France, Russia, and Great Britain. The Triple Alliance, okay, that was their peacetime name for what would become the Central Powers during the war, was made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, which had been a kind of a combined nation since what was it, 1867, I want to say off the top of my head. But yeah, it's kind of a complicated thing because you're going to have the leader of Austria being the emperor of Austria, but the king of Hungary and so on. And then you had Italy in the Triple Alliance. Now, Italy, once the war breaks out and everything, you're going to see eventually Italy changes sides. The Ottoman Empire is going to join the Central Powers. So keep in mind, during peacetime, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. Once the war breaks out, we have the Allies and the Central Powers. Okay, so what happens here is because they're all tied to powerful nations, each one of them is tied to other powerful nations, it's going to make it really hard for any problems to be dealt with. Say, if there was a problem between France and Italy, okay, France and Italy, let's just say this doesn't happen, but let's pretend like it did. Okay, France and Italy couldn't take care of it themselves because they have these powerful allies that are going to make you feel stronger. And you're like, yeah, I've got Russia and Great Britain backing me. And Italy's over here like, I've got Germany and Austria-Hungary backing me. So, it's going to drag in countries that may have stayed out of these type of things before. Okay. This is what's so dangerous about this particular way the alliances are set up. Just a map so you can kind of see where things are located. You have Central Powers, Triple Entente, um, neutral territories, and so on, just to see where they lie. And of course, you can see the Central Powers, as they come to be called, um, the Triple Alliance before the war. They are called that because look where they are. They're located sort of centrally in Europe. Another map where you can see a different perspective. You can kind of see in this map more clearly. There's Russia. There's the Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey today. You're going to have a better view of some of the other places that we're going to talk about and so on. But if you look at this map, I mean, the map changes quite a bit, but look down there toward, I don't know, like right under Austria-Hungary, south of Austria-Hungary, you have a country called Serbia. That one's going to be really important. There's Montenegro, there's Albania, there's all these areas down there. This is going to be called the Balkans. And that's where World War I is really going to get started officially as things happen there. Now, there's going to be four empires that are going to fall during World War I. Four empires that are going to fall, that are not going to be around at the end of World War I. Okay, so if we were in class, I would have you either tell me or guess or something. So I'll just tell you. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to be gone after World War I. The German Empire. Okay, remember, German Empire started in 1871, Franco-Prussian War. William I was crowned emperor in the Palace of Versailles. Yikes, all right, the most French place ever. You're going to have the Russian Empire because they're going to have the Bolshevik or the Communist Revolution. They become the Soviet Union. And then the Ottoman Empire. Okay, those are the four empires that are going to fall during World War I. The Serbs. Now, here's something we need to know. The Serbs. Serbs, we have to define, really, as an ethnic group. They live in many countries, as you can, if you're of any sort of ethnicity, but they were descended from the southern Slavic peoples. Okay, remember the Slavs? We've got the people, the Poles, etc. The area, like I always say when I was growing up, it was Czechoslovakia. So we've got the Czech Republic and Slovakia and so on nowadays. But the Southern Slavic peoples is an ethnic group. Now, Serbs. The Serbs are spread out a little bit, but you're going to see in 1914, by 1914, Serbia had a country. It was a sovereign nation. okay, was made up of a lot of people from this ethnicity. Now, it turns out that Russia had helped Serbia gain its independence. Russia felt like it was kind of a big brother to the Serbs, right? There's some ethnic, some ethnic connections there. Bosnia, though, is a territory that we're going to see in just a minute that had a lot of Serbs populating it, but they were under the control of Austria and they wanted their freedom. They either wanted to become part of Serbia or they wanted to become their own independent nation. This is going to be a problem. We had all of those four major causes of World War I simmering for a long time. It's just like a powder keg. It could be sitting over there in a corner somewhere in some obscure shack, and nothing ever happens. But then somebody goes in and lights a match or something, and then everything blows up. So what I've always called it, the spark that set off the war is going to happen. You need to know this date. Thank goodness you get to use your notes now on these tests, right? June 28th, 1914, in Sarajevo, Bosnia. This is where it's all going to happen. This is where we see the spark that causes World War I to really begin, with all of those other things that we've already talked about swirling around. This is what sets it off. Take note that you can see on the map Serbia it's got a solid line around its independence, sovereign. You have Bosnia with a dotted line, which is why it's like that, because what I said earlier, it's actually a territory of Austria-Hungary or Austria. Anyway, Bosnia wants to join with Serbia or become their own independent nation. The Austro-Hungarian Empire does not want that to happen. Now you notice over there, remember the Turks were driven from most of this area that's called the Balkans in the 1800s, and they were replaced with all these different European powers, as you're going to see if you look in there who's in control of some of these regions. But again, Russia had helped Serbia become an independent nation. And then again, there's a lot of bad feelings because Bosnia is not a sovereign nation. So what's going to happen is the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie is going to happen on this day, June 28th, 1914, in Sarajevo, Bosnia. So what happens is we have Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, who had come over to the territory of Bosnia, and there's a young man named Gavrilo Princip who was only about 19 years old. We're not entirely sure how old he was. We think he was 19. And there was a group of assassins that had been organized and trained by a group called the Black Hand. Okay, now Black Hand was a secret military society that it had been working for a united territory with the southern Slavic peoples. Okay, they didn't want it to be ruled by Austria or anything like that. So anyway, they're gonna be brought up a lot when we talk about the beginning of World War One. So earlier in the day, they had this parade, and there were I think there were 7 trained assassins on the parade route because they knew where the parade was going to be. There's, Franz Ferdinand, his wife, and they're in an open car. And you had several guys that had grenades and guns and all kinds of stuff that they had been trained in using. So the first guy, apparently, from at least there's a couple of different versions of this story, but the first guy, the assassin, the first one, when Franz Ferdinand's car went by him, he did not throw his grenade. He did not shoot because he said when he was caught later something to the effect of he didn't want to harm any women and children. There were too many women and children there. So I believe it was either the second or the third of the trained assassins who did throw a grenade at Franz Ferdinand and Sophie's car, but it bounced off their car and hit the car behind them in the parade. That injured some people. And so they went on to the governor's residence. Okay, remember he's the governor of that section of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Franz Ferdinand is the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he was so angry. He says, "Oh, we come here to visit and you welcome us with bombs." So anyway, Sophie and Franz Ferdinand, they're going to be at the governor's residence for a while, and they decided they wanted to go to the hospital and check on the people who were injured. Now, the problem was no one told the drivers of the car that things were changed, okay? So it's one of those things that just, if you saw it in a movie, you would say, really? Really? This really happened? This, yeah, you suspend disbelief or whatever. But yeah, this really happened, okay? So what happens is they're going the different direction. They're going where they were originally going to go instead of headed toward the hospital. So they have to turn around. Now the cars are backing up and they back in to make like a 3-point turn. And so some of the cars stalled. Now, the car that Sophie and Franz Ferdinand were in stalled, and you can't just try to start it back up again. My understanding of that car, if I'm not mistaken, was that it was a crank model where you had to get out and crank it in the front. Okay, so anyway, here's where it gets very much unbelievable, but it is true. Okay, Gavril Princip, one of the assassins, the young man, supposedly, according to some stories, he was sitting having a sandwich at a cafe there in the capital of Sarajevo. Some say he was actually just window shopping, walking around, and when the car stalls, either way, they say he was within 5 to 15 feet of Franz Ferdinand. So he pulls out his pistol and he shoots Sophie in the abdomen, and my understanding is that she was pregnant. And then he shot Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Okay. Now, Franz Ferdinand, supposedly, there was a guy who was on the running board of the car, one of the the guards, and he's going to tell the story where he was standing there talking to Franz Ferdinand as he was dying, and supposedly his dying words to his wife were, "Don't die, think of our children." So it turns out that what the guy on the running board said happened was that when the car was reversing and all this kind of stuff, what had happened was his wife Sophie saw something going on. This is the guy who was, I believe, on the running board, and it turned out to be blood. And the Duchess said, "For heaven's sake, what happened to you?" And at that point, she was shot and she fell down, between her husband's knees, and they thought she fainted. Now, her husband knew what happened, but again, he's got a bullet that he's taken in his neck. So he kind of sags down himself. They're unable to save him. They're unable to save her. And, again, they're going to die very, very quickly. I've read within about 15 minutes or so. So what's happened here is a terrible thing. Okay, this is the assassination of a rather small figure in the world and his wife by a Serbian nationalist, a guy who's, wanting a Serbian, a Slavic nation, and to get all of the Serbs out from under control of Austria. Gavril Princip. Now, if you're interested at all in him, he ends up dying in prison. I believe he dies of tuberculosis, but he doesn't really live long enough, I don't think, to see exactly what happened. The mass horror that is World War One. And the picture on the right, again, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie, one of the last pictures that was taken of them before the assassination as they get in the car to go in the parade. Austria-Hungary makes kind of an error in judgment. And I'm going to call it Austria just for the sake of it's easier. Okay, but we know it's the combined, Austro-Hungarian Empire. But anyway, so about a week after the assassination, the Austrians were well aware that they couldn't win a war if they had to fight Serbia alone. So July 5th of 1914, Franz Joseph, who was actually the emperor, I believe, of Austria, the king of Hungary, okay, and that weird setup they had. But anyway, he sends a letter to Kaiser, Emperor William II of Germany, and he says, okay, what would happen if Austria decides to attack Serbia because, they've killed Franz Ferdinand, they've killed the heir and his wife. What should we do? Well, William II gave a blank check. Now, I want you to understand. I want you to fully understand. This is not a blank check of money. It has nothing to do with money. Basically, he's giving his unrivaled, bridled, complete support, saying that sure, you want to fight with Serbia and get them under control, the Germans will support you fully. Okay, so that's a big mistake. It's called Germany's blank check. Again, Austria makes a little bit of error in judgment. They wait a while. They wait till the period of July 23rd, and they're going to issue an ultimatum to Serbia. Okay, this is 3 weeks later, and they demand that the Serbian government denounce the aims and activities of Bosnian Serbs. Okay, that part's easy. Sure, Serbia can easily say, we didn't sanction that. We think they were wrong, these Bosnian Serbs that assassinated your heir. Of course we think that's wrong. But look at the black, the bold here. The part that I have bold, and allow Austrian officials to prosecute and punish any Serbian officials who were involved. That is the part that the Serbs cannot agree to, okay, which is why this is an ultimatum, okay? What Austria is doing is they're saying to a sovereign nation, Serbia, you know what? We want to come into your country. We want to find these guys. We want to punish them. That's not going to happen if you are indeed an independent sovereign nation. Okay? If something happened and Canada, okay, because they're close and we like to pick on Canada because we love them, right? But let's say something happened and the Canadians said, hey, some Americans came up here and killed someone who's related to the prime minister. We're coming into the United States. We're going to check it out and we're going to prosecute and punish any Americans who were involved. The United States would have to say, no, you can't just come into our country and, exert your authority. No. Okay, Austria knew this. Austria made this demand so unreasonable because they had a whole purpose here. Austria wants war, okay, now that especially that they've got Germany behind them, but Austria wants war because they want to restore order in Bosnia. Bosnia is causing them all kinds of pain because of, wanting their independence and stuff, and to crush Serbia because Serbia is a thorn in their side too. That whole area called the Balkans has just got the Austrians having one issue after another, and really the Austrians feel completely out of control. And they think the best way to do it is just go in, let's just destroy them, take them over completely once and for all. Well, that's not going to work out very well. I mentioned before that Franz Ferdinand was not a huge player on the world stage. I mean, he just wasn't. So, why did this assassination really become the spark that set off the Great War? Okay. Well, I have on here every nation has some blame that they have to shoulder. So, Germany, we know what the Germans did. I mean, Kaiser William II, with his blank check to Austria, emboldened the Austrians to go and, decide that they were going to give this ultimatum to Serbia. And another thing Kaiser William II did was, well, once war was declared, Germany didn't really try all that hard to solve the issues through diplomacy. They seemed to be quite happy with going to war in some ways, right? They weren't stepping in and saying, okay, let's try to work this out by talking about it. No, 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 because we have the military mindset taking over any political rationale with the invasion of Belgium and France by Germany. Okay, this is going to be bad. The Germans are going to really end up, again, being one of the major belligerents in both world wars. It's not just Germany's fault for not doing certain things. It's, there's a lot of things going on here, okay? All these countries are going to have some responsibility. The Germans are going to point back to Russia, who had mobilized, and the Russians are going to say, hey, wait a minute, Austria threatened Serbia. And Serbia is going to say, wait a minute, Austria, blah. And then Austria is going to say, Serbia, did the assassination, blah, 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 blah. Okay? You can read that. That's going to deal with the Germans, the Russians, the Austrians, and the Serbs. Okay? What about Great Britain and France, though? Why are they getting involved? Well, remember, they have alliances. Great Britain and France are allied with Russia. Russia's getting involved because of the threat to the Serbs and all of that. So, okay, what about this? Great Britain is also afraid that if Germany continues rising, that they would pose a great threat to Great Britain. Okay? Great Britain does not like the idea of German colonization as the Germans are spreading out a little bit more. France, for their part, I mean, not only were Great Britain and France allies of Russia, but I mean, they each have their own bone to pick here. France was still angry about the loss of Alsace-Lorraine way back in the Franco-Prussian War, I believe. And they're also still really angry from that indemnity, from that 5 billion franc pay off our war debts because you lost, France, that Prussia put on them back in 1871. Okay? So Great Britain and France, as allies of Russia, are not going to ask Russia to step back. Hey, Russia, stand down. Let's think about this. Most people don't know this. Most people, if you've studied really any European history from this era, you've heard before of the blank check from Germany. But what you might not know is that France had sort of given Russia another version of the blank check. France had said, sure, we'll back you. If you have to fight to protect Serbia, we're right behind you. So again, here comes the alliances, and anything that could have possibly been settled in a diplomatic way is not going to be settled. Okay, it's going to be bloodshed from this point on. Okay, this is the beginning. I mentioned the Russian mobilization. Okay, so when all this is going on with Austria and Serbia and so on, Tsar Nicholas was, I believe, on a vacation, on a holiday or something, and he says, all right, look, let's just order a partial mobilization of the army. Now, the general said this can't happen. We can't do a partial mobilization. That would be absolutely crazy. Okay, nobody would know where they were supposed to be. No one would know what they were supposed to be doing. And they just pretty much said, nope, we cannot do that, Your Highness. And so Nicholas II is going to say, okay, well then, I guess we're going to have to mobilize completely to protect the Serbs. So when the Russians did mobilize on July 29th of 1914, they knew that this was an act of war. I mean, this is something that happens. If you have, I think back again to the wars of unification of Germany, and just for an example. But if you have mobilizations of the military on your border, you're going to know that's an act of war. So the Germans saw this and they realized, this is not going to go away. If you've never heard of the Schlieffen Plan, you're about to. Okay. This is a very important thing. The Schlieffen Plan was something that came about from German General Alfred von Schlieffen. Remember the von, that means you have some noble background, right? But Alfred von Schlieffen had assumed that there would be a two-front war with France and Russia at some point. Now, Bismarck, remember Bismarck had always tried to keep France and Russia away from each other. Bismarck had this incredibly complex series of alliances, and he knew it would be very bad for Germany if France and Russia became allies because they would be, on either side of Germany. So anyway, Schlieffen was told to come up with a strategy. How are we going to be able to fight a two-front war if this happens? Now, yeah, it does happen, and it's because of William II, but that's a whole other story. William II had refused to renew a kind of an agreement with Russia, and so the Russians were out there kind of looking for a new ally, and we end up Bismarck turning over in his grave, I'm certain, as France and Russia get together as allies. Okay, strange bedfellows, as we're going to see. Anyway, Schlieffen was told to come up with an idea where we could do this as Germany. So in 1905, he already had what he calls, the Schlieffen Plan, or what becomes called the Schlieffen Plan, to figure out a way to win a war between, France, Russia, and Germany. The Schlieffen Plan has a great strategy. I mean, it's magnificent. Okay. The idea was they were going to defeat France in 6 weeks, just like they had back in 1871 in the Franco-Prussian War. No problem. Sure. We did it before. Now, the idea also was then in the East, they were going to hold off Russia. Now, in Germany, they had the belief that Russia was big and bulky, and their military would take a long time to fully mobilize, probably at least 6 months, maybe longer. So we're holding off Russia with a few troops because they're not really doing much. We're down there fighting France. And so by the time we invade France, we're going to go through Belgium, which is neutral. And you're just going to ask Belgium, hey, we need to get in here. We need to go through your country. We know you're peaceful. We're just going to kind of cross here. We're going to go into France. No problem, right? Well, okay, that's the idea. And they were going to be going through Belgium in order to outflank the French armies, and they were going to take the capital of France, Paris. That sounds fantastic on paper. Doesn't work. Does not work. Slide 19, we have a very famous diagram here, map, of the Schlieffen Plan. Okay, and you can see coming from Germany, going through neutral Luxembourg and Belgium. And the idea is we're going to go and, outflank the French. We're going to take Paris. All's going to be well in the world and so on. Okay, it's not going to work. Now, I did see this particular map. It's, as I said, pretty famous. But I did see it one time when I was looking in a European history, like an AP test. And really, it just showed you that map. It didn't say the Schlieffen Plan. It was like, all right, write an essay about what this represents. So this is the Schlieffen Plan. So the question is, why did it not work? It does not work. Sounded great on paper, as I said before. Why did it fail? Well, here's why it failed. Okay. So as the Germans are coming over, going to go through Belgium, the Belgians were like, no, we really don't want this to happen. I mean, there's stories of the Belgians, the civilians, whoever, out there throwing rocks at the Germans as they're coming in. It's going to put up, they're going to put up some pretty good resistance that nobody really expected. Now, also, the Germans never thought the Russians would mobilize really quickly, but they did. It was nowhere near 6 months by the time they mobilized. And instead of having the luxury of fighting just the French and just holding off the Russians for a while, but fighting the French and getting them under control, they're going to have to send some of their troops to the Eastern Front over to Russia, okay, to help the Austrians who are fighting over there. So the French are going to counterattack at the Battle of the Marne on September 5th. Now, this is not the first battle of World War I, but this is probably, well, okay, this is the first significant battle of World War I. Let's put it that way, okay? And the French counterattacked, and they stopped the German drive to Paris. So the Germans couldn't take Paris. They were barely holding off the Russians. And what we call the Western Front, hence the book that you've been reading, hopefully by this point, okay, the Western Front is going to stalemate for 4 years into what we call trench warfare, okay? We'll talk about trench warfare again in just a minute. If we're looking at it, right here, we're looking at a German Big Bertha, one of the big guns that they use. Look at the men and look at the size of that gun right there, that cannon. So France and Germany declared war on each other in August of 1914, August 3rd. Great Britain pops in, declaring war on Germany on August 4th. So by August 4th, all the great powers of Europe are at war. The Great War has now begun. There are a lot of things at the time that were unique about World War I, also called the Great War, also called the war to end all wars. But one of the things that is really, really important is that World War I, like I mentioned before, I believe, was the first total war. It involves the civilians, involves you and me. It involves men, women, children, disabled people, people who are elderly or whatever. Everybody is going to have to participate in the war effort. Okay, it's going to require rationing of food. We're going to employ men and women in war plants, and boy, is the propaganda going to fly. Okay, if you look at the propaganda there, I mean, this one in the middle is a little bit later. Let's see. Well, you got some American ones there, but yeah, you've got actually two of them. The one on the right too, right? That's Uncle Sam. Yeah, because there's the red, white, and blue, and there's Uncle Sam looking a little bit different without gray hair. But anyway, what you've got here on each one of these three, though, that I picked out, each one of these three propaganda posters is going to be a word that is prominent in all of them. And this word is meant to stir emotion in you. Okay, who's absent? Is it you? Boys and girls, you can help your Uncle Sam win the war. Save your quarters. Buy war saving stamps. It's up to you. Protect the nation's honor. Enlist now. Okay, so we're getting into this fever pitch with propaganda, propaganda, propaganda. It's going to be bad in World War One. It's going to be terrible in World War Two. Here's a poster labeled "The Allies Onward to Victory." You can see in here who are some of the smaller allies. I mean, we have Great Britain, France, and Russia. And then we also have Belgium, who, was neutral, but okay, And you have Serbia over there, as well as Japan and Montenegro, another of the Balkan nations. So going to see a little bit of strange bedfellows here because Japan is going to be on the opposite side in World War II. And I remember also, I've always liked history. I mean, that should be no surprise to you guys. But I remember when I first learned that when I was a kid, I was like, how did that happen? And also, I grew up during the Cold War. So I was like, wait, why was Russia on our side in both world wars? And decided to figure all that stuff out in my mind. But anyway, it's a little interesting, a little interesting um, representation of the Allies and their flags and so on. More propaganda posters. I love propaganda posters. I think they're so interesting. But here's one from, Australia. Fall in. We want you at the front. Come and help enlist at once. And then here's the American Red Cross. And we don't get into this war until very late, but we still have our share of propaganda. Our boys need socks. Knit your bit. The sides we've already talked about. I mentioned that you need to know these. I mean, as I said too, luckily you get to use your notes and PowerPoints and whatever on these exams because they are at home and they are online. And I don't blame you. That's what I would do too. But I do hope you guys are learning a lot. I hope you're taking all of this very seriously and trying to get some stuff that will stick with you once you leave this class. And I really, really wish we could have had the class in person, the whole rest of the semester. I think that that's better for all of us, to be perfectly honest with you. But, things happen. We have to be pretty resilient sometimes. Okay, so anyway, the sides, we've got the Allies, Great Britain, France, and Russia. Okay. Now, the Allies, remember, were former members of the Triple Entente. The Triple Entente was the name of that alliance before the war began. Okay. Now, you see all these different things going on. Italy is going to join the Allies in 1915. Italy stayed neutral for a while. It was an ally and then just stayed neutral and then joined the Allies. Or yeah, did I say that right? Italy was an ally of the Central Powers and then stayed neutral for a while and then joined the Allies. Yeah. Russia's going to have their civil war. I mean, their Bolshevik revolution, their communist takeover, their whatever. Russia's having problems. So Russia leaves in 1917. United States is actually going to declare war in April of 1917 because of some events that happen that kind of pull us into World War One, and we come in on the side of the Allies. Okay, Russia leaves in, so it's a very strange bunch of people entering and leaving at different times. Central powers, you're going to have Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. They were the Triple Alliance at first, and then when the war began, Italy's neutral, and then again left and went to the Allies. Ottoman Empire pops in, Turkey, and they're going to join the Central Powers in 1915. So again, When the guns start firing, the guns of August, which is actually on the next slide, I think, when the guns of August begin firing and the war is on, the former Triple Entente become the Allies. The former Triple Alliance become the Central Powers, okay, for the most part. If you're a person who's really interested in history, particularly 20th century history, or if you're a history major at all, you need to read The Guns of August. Now, I don't know if you would want to read it now. I don't know if you'd want to wait until you have more experience and knowledge about World War One and maybe even a little bit back before that, some of the connections between the families and the crowned heads of Europe and all that. But this is a fantastic book. It's very important. Barbara Tuchman, one of the great female historians, wrote this book, won Pulitzer Prize for it, and it's written. It starts out, if you don't know a lot about the people and who's involved in terms of the individuals, you're going to find that in the beginning you might be a little bit lost. Okay, you have to kind of go through there and figure out who's related to who, because they're all sharing their grandmother, and again, all these leaders, for the most part, they're related somehow. Remember the blue bloods, they want to keep the pure blood in their family, in general. So they're going to be intermarrying for many, 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 many generations. But the Great War, as Barbara Tuchman describes it in The Guns of August, she's describing the beginning of the war. And it is a book that I highly recommend for anyone who enjoys that type of thing. And sadly, there's not a lot of people who read anymore the way we used to, but it's well worth it if you like history. I think that's a fantastic book. Okay, so what goes on here then is, again, the first big important battle of World War One. I'm going to call it's the Battle of the Marne, sometimes called the First Battle of Marne. And that's, as the Schlieffen Plan is failing. You have the British and the French, counterattacking on the outskirts of Paris. The Germans are not able to take Paris. And what we see here is there's going to be a stalemate with 4 years of trench warfare, just like what I said you're reading about, or hopefully have already read, in All Quiet on the Western Front. Now, the Allies are going to attack the German armies and push them away from Paris. But the most important consequence of this Battle of the Marne is that the French and British forces were able to prevent the Schlieffen Plan from working. Okay, coming in and beating the French in 6 weeks was not going to happen. Okay, in World War I, that does not happen. So the Germans were not beaten down enough, though, that they were willing to quit. So they retreated. Uh-oh, the war is going to go on. Nobody really understands how long this war is going to go on. It's going to go on until November of 1918, you guys. But nobody knew that. And when the boys went off, there was the whole saying when they took off to go to war that the boys would be home for Christmas. Well, no, they weren't home for Christmas for quite a while. Now, in this battle, look at this. Okay, it goes from September 5th or 6th to September 10th of 1914. Look at the numbers, y'all. Look at the numbers. The French lost 250,000 people. Germans, we think, lost about that number, but they never told us. The British Expeditionary Force lost 13,000 men. This is incredible. Look at that. A few days of battle. These numbers would, if this happened today in a war, we would, I don't know how the parents, the moms that were at home, their sons have gone off, or the wives, their husbands have gone off, or whoever. I don't know how they dealt with that. But again, we're resilient. People are very resilient. We have to be. And I can't even imagine what it would have been like to live through such losses. And this is only one battle right here. I've always found this picture to be pretty cool. This is where it shows the I guess the oh gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? The enthusiasm for war. Remember in All Quiet on the Western Front, the guys think, this is going to be a great adventure and all this, and we're going to have all these women, and we're going to just have it, yeah, all this kind of stuff. It's going to be fantastic. Well, not so much. It's wartime. But look at this. This is a great picture. You have taxi cabs lining up to carry French troops to the battle. Okay. They were rushed from Paris to the battle by any possible way they could get there. This is, again, this is crazy. Okay. You got the buses, you got taxi cabs, you got this, you got that. But I love that picture. I think that's kind of a well, it's definitely a time capsule type picture. So the Western Front devolves into trench warfare for 4 years. What does that mean? Well, the trenches are going to extend across France from the North Sea all the way over to Switzerland. And we've got all kinds of developments going on in World War One. Some of them really terrible, like the poison gases. We've got mustard gas, all these terrible things. You can look up some of the gases that they used in World War One if you really want to get really just, I don't know, just creeped out at man's inhumanity to man. It's terrible. But we're gonna have better machine guns, and we're gonna have tanks. We're gonna have, the aircraft that, well, airplanes had not been around very long in 1914. We figure out pretty quickly how to kill each other with aircraft, which is also a sad statement about the way humans treat other humans. But you're going to see that, I mean, basically, practically a generation of young Western European men are going to die in the trenches over there in France and Flanders, North France, Belgium, Netherlands, this whole area over there. They're going to die in the Western Front over where, your main character in All Quiet on the Western Front, Paul Baumer. Okay, that's where he is. That's where he and his friends are in the trenches. So, yeah, I mean, um, this is a terrible thing to go through. Um, the men, I believe it was this war. Was it this war that they called it shell shock? Because I think, I mean, I know, like today we talk about PTSD a lot, post traumatic stress disorder, but in World War One, I believe what they called it was shell shock. It's the same thing. And they thought, though, they didn't understand a lot of the psychological stuff we do today. And they believed that it was a result of some kind of a physical injury to your nerves and something to do with, having the bombs physically hurt you somehow. And we know today, I mean, when we talk about shell shock, we can see clearly this is PTSD because you're going to have the symptoms. They're going to be returning from the trenches. They're going to be going home or whatever, and the doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with them, and they're going to come home sometimes paralyzed or just all sorts of things. And so eventually they start to realize that this is something that has changed their bodies. So that's where they start blaming it on the nerves. And um, again, there was even a time when they called it war neuroses. Okay, so again, you're going to have all sorts of different symptoms of shell shock. I mean, paralysis, like I said. You're going to have people having nightmares, insomnia, heart palpitations, depression, loss of appetite, all kinds of stuff again. So you're going to have by 1917, roughly almost half of the men, I believe, were suffering from some degree or another of shell shock. So here's a representation of the Western Front. You can see if you look on here that it has on the left-hand side, you've got no man's land. That's the area between the trenches of the opposing groups, right? And they've got, yeah, if you look at it a little while, you can get a lot out of this, but you have to look at it for a little bit. But you've got the front line trench, a support trench, reserve trench, long range artillery, and we've got, the Germans. They were sometimes digging as far as 15 meters below ground, and they were really settling in. Okay, sometimes they're going to have concrete protection down there. And anyway, you're going to have barbed wire over in no man's land. You're going to have bodies over there sometimes. It's a terrible place. Slide number 31. I usually kind of just let you read that one on your own, because what basically people have the idea that World War I, the trenches were all connected and very complicated, and yeah, all sorts of things. But in the early days of the war, the fighting was mobile. I mean, after the first Battle of the Marne, which again was the big significant one, in the first one that was really big and significant in my opinion, but the fighting was mobile. But once we get to the situation where people are digging in and staying in one place, that's called static. And the trench systems, they were very simple. They were not elaborate and complex. Now, later on, you're going to see it get much more complex and complicated. And you're going to see the trench systems by the end of the war once again getting disconnected with big gaps. So the trench warfare, it's not like you can just look at, say, that thing I showed you on the last slide, that picture. You can't just look at that and say, well, that's how it was all across the Western Front, because that's not true. Okay, it's going to be very different depending on where you are. Here's a picture of guys in a trench, and you're living down there, you're eating down there, you're sleeping down there, you're living down there. Okay, no matter what, if it rains, it floods down there. If someone dies down there, you're going to be sitting there with their body a lot of times, waiting for a chance maybe to go and bury them. And just the horrors. There's going to be rats down there in the trenches that some people said were as big as dogs that were feeding on some of the bodies. There's terrible things that are going to happen in those trenches. And it's it's almost unimaginable to me what it would have been like to have to stay down there under just the constant threat of death in so much discomfort constantly. And again, I keep saying humans are very resilient. We bounce back usually. But I mean, when I think of the guys that had shell shock, or today, PTSD, and I think World War II actually, I think it was called battle fatigue. But I don't know how anyone didn't get that from what I know about the wars. More pictures, because as I always say, I love pictures. So again, you've got one. I think that picture must be colorized. I don't think in 1914 they had color film, but yeah, don't quote me on that. I could be wrong, although I don't think I am. But the one on the left, you can see, how the conditions are, and you're going to try to have your own kind of space somehow. The men are going to sleep in dugouts sometimes. Holes just cut into the sides of the trenches. And it doesn't provide them much protection, but it's something. It serves a little psychologically, I think, a need for some sort of, as I said before, space to have as your own, even if it's a little space and not much worth, just something that maybe is just your spot. But it does provide a little protection depending on where the attack, um, whatever, where they hit, how close they are to you, if it's a direct hit or whatever. But it's always amazing to me to look back at all the pictures and just look at the faces and look at these people and realize these are real people that went through these things, and these are just moments of their lives and what happened to them. That's just the way my mind works. And then when you read All Quiet on the Western Front, you can get Eric Maria Remarquez, um, his novelized, his fictionalized stories about his perspective of what happened to some of these guys from the trenches. And here we have the guys in the trenches again, bundled up. Um, there's not much to say about that. Again, like I said, I like to look at the faces and wonder what they're thinking, wonder what they've been through. One of the problems you could encounter if you were down there in the trenches for too long is called trench foot. So trench foot is a legitimate condition where if you're unable to change your socks, your shoes, you're exposed to a lot of water, rain, whatever, and you're unable to change, to let your feet dry out, and they're constantly wet. They can become numb. Or you're going to end up with probably a poor blood supply coming to your feet, and you're going to see eventually that your foot looks like it's rotting off. In some cases it is, because you're going to have open sores and infections and ulcers and so on. Now, what happens with trench foot, what makes it so incredibly dangerous, is it's gonna if it's not treated and if it's not caught in time, it's gonna result in gangrene. And gangrene is tissue death, right? Because the blood supply is not there. So you're gonna have your skin changing from black, and it's going to go from, I guess, what, red, and then go to black as it's dying, necrosis, right? Numbness and pain, and just it's going to be terrible. The feet are affected also. Sometimes you can have this happen, sometimes in your hands, but mostly trench foot itself is going to happen. Specifically, we're talking about this time in the trenches, but I mean, it's any time that your feet are going to be exposed too long to wet, maybe dirty and cold conditions. So gangrene is going to cause you to have an amputation usually. And a lot of times it's going to be able, today especially, you're going to be able to fix something like that usually if someone's caught out and they end up in some kind of an emergency situation where they're exposed like that we can usually fix that. We can usually take care of that today. But prevention is basically to keep your feet dry, and clean. And you can't really do that when you're down there in the trenches, in the dirt. And again, they're not taking baths. They're not, again, you're not going to be able to go out and say, "Hey man, I'm gonna go out here and take a nice bath and get all clean and everything." It's not really going to work down there. Here we are at no man's land, the land between the trenches, okay? The land between the opposing groups, okay? So you're going to have, say, for example, the French on one side and the Germans on the other side. And they're firing each other over no man's land. Now it could be, yeah, could be pretty short distance, maybe a few hundred yards between the trenches. Sometimes, maybe a mile, a kilometer, but it depends. It depends on where you were. But it was called no man's land. It's the area between the opposing sides. Here's another great book for you readers. It's called Silent Night, and it's a great story. It's true, about the 1914 Christmas truce. Now, what happened here is we had a bunch of guys from both sides that are going to meet in the middle in no man's land. And they're going to do not a formal truce, but you're going to have, well, let me just start at the beginning here, okay? You're going to have the story here, the boys are going to be home for Christmas. Well, they weren't. And so here it is. It's Christmas, Christmas Eve. And the Germans love Christmas, and the German soldiers are over there on their side, and they're singing Christmas carols. And the French soldiers on the other side, they hear them and they start clapping. And then the French and the British who were there, they started singing Christmas carols back to the Germans, and the Germans would clap for them. And it turned out, I mean, at some point, some guys just kind of came out there, kind of like, look, man, it's Christmas. And they met up in the middle, and then more and more guys kept coming out. Now, this is going to go on for a few days. As these men get sort of to know each other, they're going to share chocolates, cigarettes, whatever they've got to share. They're going to show each other pictures of their wives and their families. And they become real to each other. They become human to each other. So eventually the commanding officers are just furious. And they end up telling them, go back to the war, go back to fighting. Well, they start shooting over the heads of these men who they had actually gotten to know as human beings. And so anyway, what happens is a lot of these guys who had participated in this were transferred because they would not shoot at the guys they had been out there looking at pictures with and sharing just Christmas with them. Never happened. It was not an official thing, as I said. Or never happened again. Sorry, never happened again. But man, the commanding officers had a really rough time stopping this. But it's a beautiful story if you ever get a chance to read that book. And I know there's been at least one documentary made about that. Christmas Truce of 1914. The Battle of Verdun. The Battle of Verdun is going to be one of the longest and greatest and bloodiest battles in history. And it's going to last from February 1916 until December 1916, with we believe at least, well, we know at least 250,000 dead, another at least 500,000 wounded, and it's arguably the longest battle, one of the bloodiest, World War One. Again, like I said, maybe in world history. Problem comes, we can't really we can't really give the numbers for a lot of battles back in the in ancient history and in medieval times or in early modern history, but and also even in the time of World War One, World War Two, there's always going to be somebody who's not going to want to report their numbers accurately for whatever reasons. But the Battle of Verdun is extraordinarily horrible, and you see the picture there of the city of Verdun burning. So part of the problem with the Battle of Verdun was that one of the generals on the German side decided that it was more important at that point for them to kill the French than it was to actually take the territory. Okay, the French, they were trying to defend Verdun, and again, the Germans are advancing. The Germans are heading toward. They want to get to Paris. They want to take France, but the Germans are going to make some major mistakes. Everybody's gonna suffer so much for the Battle of Verdun. And in February of 1916, when it starts, we've got more than 1,000 guns, and this is in probably a 8 to 10 mile perimeter that start fighting. And this is going to be something that we see throughout the Battle of Verdun. It's going to be just brutal. And they're going to start ordering, the Germans are going to start ordering the men to take out the French just without regard to whether they kill them, just, wound them, kill them. And the Germans are going to advance quite a bit within a week or two. Okay. So the French are in trouble at this point. And I think it was what? It was June. I think it was June of 1916 that the Germans are going to take some strongholds, and they're going to actually going to get very close to victory a few times. But the Germans are not going to be able to pull this off. And here's a picture that was taken in a trench before the Battle of Verdun began. The Eastern Front. I don't concentrate too much on the Eastern Front when it comes to World War One. I mean, we spend more time, of course, on the Western Front, but the front in the East is actually going to be longer than the Western Front. And this is where you're going to have trench warfare in the West, but over in the East, over, Russia and the Baltic Sea and over in those regions, you're not going to have the trenches. You're going to have still retreats and advances, something you're not going to have the way you did over on the West. But especially this semester, in the interest of time and making sure you have time to do everything and trying to give you guys a little bit less stress. We're not going to talk much at all. That's pretty much all I'm going to say about the Eastern Front. I mean, this is where you're going to see Russia, invading German territory. We're going to see some battles, but the main thing I need you to know is that while in the West we had that very just, static trench warfare, in the East they're going to continue to be mobile, and there's going to be some retreats and some advances and those type of things. So, we could go into a lot more detail about the East, but let's not do that this time. Just again, in the interest of time. Ah, the Lusitania. Now, this made big headlines. Lusitania, fancy ship that it was a passenger ship, and it's going to be sunk by a German submarine in unrestricted submarine warfare. And it's going to be, torpedoed off the Irish coast. It was coming from New York. And this is going to be an incredibly powerful moment in World War One for a couple reasons. I mean, first of all, the Germans are saying, look, we're going to shoot whoever's out there that we think, that we have intelligence that they're doing something against our interest. Okay. And it's also going to be something that doesn't directly immediately get the United States involved in World War One, but it does start making us think that, wow, we might end up having to participate in this war at some point. So in the spring, in May of 1915, the Lusitania was coming back to England from New York, and it had about a couple thousand passengers and crew and everything. And again, the Germans had already been torpedoing people with the German U-boats or submarines, and they were kind of warned to avoid certain areas. Lusitania was warned to avoid certain areas and try to change course very often and try to, it make it a little bit harder for those submarines to actually attack them. Well, the captain didn't listen to that, and a torpedo struck, and there was an explosion, and within between 20-25 minutes, the Lusitania had sunk, and well over 1,000 people were killed, drowned, and you're going to have 128 United States citizens who were killed on that ship. Now, Woodrow Wilson, the American president, had already made a point that he wanted us to stay neutral. But again, the Lusitania is going to make us start thinking that, wow, we might get dragged into this war after all. So the Germans said they had intelligence that basically told them the Lusitania was not just a passenger ship, that it was carrying munitions. And I don't just mean a little bit of munitions. I don't just mean, hey, a little munitions, we'll carry a few pistols. Oh, no, 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 no. It was well over 170 tons, okay, that they were taking to the British, to the Allies, okay? Now, this is crazy because the people didn't really understand at first. They're like, oh man, this unrestricted German submarine warfare, rather, this is terrible. This is terrible. Well, in my opinion, I've always thought that because it was a passenger ship, that since they were carrying obviously contraband, I mean, it's pretty much like the Lusitania, whoever knew what was going on, where they had all of those munitions and everything, the weaponry, it's like they were almost using the passengers as human shields, thinking, well, nobody's actually going to sink that, this ship, the Lusitania, if we have all of these civilians on here. Well, they were also very wrong.
Greyhound of the seas, the
What,
Lusitania was the
what
fastest
is going
passenger liner
on
of her
here? Oh,
time.
look at this.
Yet in the end, she
I love
wasn't
it. I
fast
said
enough to
something
outrun
about
the German
Lusitania and
submarine
it
which
just
sank
pops
her
up.
during World War I. when it set out for Liverpool, England, from New York on
Ah,
May 1st, 19...
sorry. Anyway, that's funny. Oh, one time I was recording one of these PowerPoint videos not too long ago, and I was just sitting here and I was doing just what I'm doing now, and I heard something really strange, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, what is that?" And it was Donald Trump's voice, and something had popped up on the computer, and Donald Trump was giving a speech. I think maybe it was one of the like the virus updates that they do every single day. And I was like, oh my goodness. So anyway, well, okay, at least you got the Lusitania popping up. That's cool. That's apropos. Okay. Here's the type of publicity that happened for quite a while after the Lusitania was sunk. You have some of the burials, the mass graves of the Lusitania victims in 1915. And that is just a picture of a German U-boat as, what does it say at the bottom? Breaking surface. Okay. So it's just a picture, German submarine. What about the Americans? Well, again, the Lusitania does not directly get us involved in World War One. It's going to take another couple of years. It's going to be some other events that are going to happen. We enter the war in April of 1917 when Woodrow Wilson goes before Congress and, he talks about a war to make the world safe for democracy. And what had happened was in early 1917, there were a series of events. I mean, the Germans had been asked to quit, knock it off with this unrestricted submarine warfare. And they had done that for a while, and then they started it again. We also found out, the British, I think, intercepted it, and we found out about the Zimmerman telegram, where you had the Germans offering Mexico, said, hey, Mexico, if you side with us, when we defeat the Allies, we will give you part of America. We'll give you back Mexico, Mexican territory that the Americans stole from you. Okay, so you have the Zimmerman telegram. And then you also have 3 American ships that were torpedoed in early 1917. So, pretty soon it's not going to be good for the United States to stay neutral. We're going to have to go and we're going to have to help. And Wilson had known that for a while. I mean, there were groups in the United States who believed that we should be preparing just in case. And then you're going to, and that's going to be, Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, Theodore Roosevelt, who's still alive at that time, TR is going to say, look, man, he's a war hawk actually, but he's saying, look, we need to prepare. I mean, he was saying that at least in 1915, but Woodrow Wilson's, saying, nope, we're neutral, we're neutral, we're neutral. So in, let's see, how does this go? In 1916, yeah, because he was elected, Wilson was elected in 1912, then he was reelected in 1916. And the slogan was, he kept us out of war. Okay. Now, the thing is, he was asked one time, look, man, you knew we were going to war. You had already been on this mantle of preparedness for a while. Why did you let them use that as your slogan? And he's like, well, I didn't tell them to use it. I didn't tell them not to use it. Okay, Woodrow Wilson. But he kept us out of war was the slogan. Well, by the time the election's in November of 1916, and by the time he is re-inaugurated in March of 1917, I mean, he knows we're going to war. He knows we're going to war. Problem is, though, the United States does not have a lot of troops. We don't have a huge standing army. We have, what is it? 200,000, was that it? Is that how many? I think troops in the military. We just weren't a big deal in the world at that time, the way the way we're used to being, hey, we're the United States. Well, we just weren't that big of a world power. So we declare war in 1917, but we don't have enough troops to really send many of them until spring of 1918. Okay, they have to be trained, they have to be, well, they have to institute the draft, they have to get some men in the military that way. A lot of volunteers are going to come in. Now you see on the right the American Expeditionary Forces, also known as the Doughboys. And we have, of course, some more of the cool recruiting posters and so on. You've got again, you, I'm telling you, Britons, you. Britain wants you. Okay, join your country's army. God save the king. Your chums are fighting. Why aren't you? Okay, again, it's bringing it back to every man, woman, and child, whether they could serve in the war or not. This is going to be a total war. Everyone's going to play a part in it. So the Doughboys, this is the American Expeditionary Force. And again, it takes about a year before we're able to send big numbers over to Europe. Most of these boys are young, and they've really never been more than about 50 miles maximum from the place they were born in their entire lives. And just like Paul Balmer in All Quiet on the Western Front, like we mentioned before, they're going to be thinking about all the glory they're going to get, and war is going to be a great adventure, and women and whatever. Okay, well, one thing they're going to do is, because they know these guys are very much inexperienced, and they're going to try to scare them. They're going to teach them not to fraternize with the women in other countries. And remember, you have some cases of that in All Quiet on the Western Front as well. But basically, they're going to say, all right, look, even if she looks like a nice girl, the one on the left, you can't trust her. And then on the right, you have a brothel technician, which I think is a hilarious way to say prostitute. But they're basically saying you can't trust these women. And, does that work? Probably not. I mean, boys being at that age and have never really traveled away from their families for an extended period of time and on their own. I think this is sad. I mean, I told you they used all those terrible chemicals in World War One. And here's where you have a drill for the mules, the poor mules, and the men, November of 1918, which is actually the month that the war is going to end. So the Russian Revolution is really important, but we're going to hit it a little bit lightly here, again, the sake of time. But 1917, Russia's going to undergo this revolution, and it's going to end up as a communist country that when I was growing up, it was always the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So how does that happen? Well, I tried to put a bunch of stuff on here so you could read it at your leisure, or if any of this is on a test or anything, you'll have it right there in front of you, hopefully. But by 1917, you're going to see that revolution comes again to Russia. Now, there had been, a revolution attempted in 1905. We had the whole Bloody Sunday thing with Father Gapon and the workers and all that. It was kind of a test run, really. But the Russians have wanted, many of the Russians have wanted to get rid of the empire, the emperor, for a long time, the czar. So the Russian Revolution of 1917 is going to be something that really culminates in 1917 as they give us, like I said, the USSR. Now, March of 1917, you're going to see poor Nicholas. Nicholas II, he was the last of the Romanov czars. Okay, Nicholas is going to have to abdicate. And in July of 1918, he and his entire family were told they were being held in captivity, and they were told they were being taken downstairs to get a picture in the middle of the night. And that's not what happened. Okay, they had a bunch of armed men down there, and one of them read something, from a sheet of paper to Tsar Nicholas and the family, and said basically, you guys have been convicted of treason and your sentence is death. And so it was basically a firing squad. And then Nicholas and his wife Alexandria, their son, the Tsarevich, or the prince, and then their daughters were killed. Now it turned out that the bullets were bouncing off some of especially some of the women. There were some maids with them and so on. But it turned out that the guys, the assassins, or the executioners, they went over there and they had to just, they were pistol whipping the women in their faces, and trying to kill them, and getting them with bayonets and stuff. And it turned out that they had sewn diamonds inside of some of their clothing. So anyway, they ended up dead, and no, Anastasia did not escape. That's one of those weird conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories make my head hurt. But anyway, Anastasia did not escape any more than anyone else did. But that's going to end the reign of the czars. That again, Nicholas II is the last czar in Imperial Russia, and the last of the Romanovs. Last known picture we have of Nicholas, he's still dressed in his uniform there, and you've got some of his guards in the background. Here's some of the members of the royal family in Russia that were executed. You have Alexandra the Tsarina, or the Queen of Russia. You have little Alexei the Tsarevich, or the Prince. And then you have Anastasia, who's going to become the best known of the family because of the legends that, arise around her. And there's other daughters as well. Now, Alexei, the little prince, he was a hemophiliac. He had what they sometimes call the bleeder's disease. And so Alexandra had met this guy who was able to, he said, cure people. So she had brought him in, and when he was in the presence of the little boy seemed to get better. This man who had gotten connected with Alexandra, the queen of Imperial Russia, was Rasputin, known as the Mad Monk. Now, Nicholas II, during the war, he was gone a lot. And so Rasputin and Alexandria got really close. It was said that they were having an affair. I don't know. But either way, he's going to have a lot of influence, and a lot of her family didn't like it. So Rasputin is going to be killed for, his I guess that they thought he was leading her astray, and he was getting her into some weird mystical stuff or whatever. He's eventually going to be killed by a guy, I believe it's one of her relatives, Felix, somebody. But what they're going to do is they're going to they're going to poison Rasputin, and then he keeps eating the cakes, and they're going to end up shooting him, and he gets up, and by the time they come back, the one guy goes to get the other guy to say, hey, I shot him, he's dead. His body's gone. And they end up chasing him as he's running out toward the gate. And shoot him again. They start kicking him to make sure he's dead. It's not funny, but I mean, my goodness. And then it turns out that they also drown him, throw him in a river, I believe. And when his body is found, he had water in his lungs. So actually, what happened was he drowned. So he went through all that. So that's a crazy story. Look it up and read the specifics of that story sometime. It's really a wild story. Pictures of Rasputin, who was said to be a big hit with the ladies, especially the wealthy ladies, who thought, he had magical eyes, hypnotic eyes, and he charmed a lot of women, and they gathered around him, and I just don't see it. But anyway, he was a very important figure in the very late imperial Russia until his death. So the Bolshevik Revolution, the revolution in Russia, was extremely important. This is going to change so many things. So you have this, this group Bolsheviks uh, leading, a bunch of workers and soldiers and so on to overthrow the government, and it's going to end up again with the with finally the death of Nicholas and Alexandra, and the death of really of the Russian monarchy or empire. So the Bolsheviks, again, they're gonna execute the family, and so a little while after Nicholas the Tsar had abdicated back in 1917, quite a while before they were actually executed. But you're going to have Lenin. Okay, he's going to arrive over there in Petrograd, and they're going to create really kind of a temporary government formed by a group of these leaders, and you're going to have a lot of the workers involved. This is a very far left group, okay, very much um, based on socialism, based on, of course, Marxist socialism in particular. See, an interesting thing about Marxism and socialism and communism and so on, there's so many different ways that people take it and kind of change it to fit their own ideas. For example, like the Germans, the Nazis, are going to put the word socialist and workers in the name of their party, and that doesn't mean that they were either socialist or for the workers. But Lenin is going to be a little bit out there too himself when it comes to Marxism. And he agrees with some of Karl Marx. He believes, Lenin, as far as I know, as far as I remember, he agrees with getting rid of the idea of social classes. Because Karl Marx said that more evolved form of socialism was communism, where you get rid of social classes completely. However, Lenin, unlike Marx, did not really want the workers to be kind of, I guess, pushing this thing. Okay, he he was going to be more, um, to have some distinctions between the rulers and the workers, which Karl Marx would have, certainly not, I'm sure, looked kindly upon if you read the Marxist ideas and that we've talked about in here as well. So anyway, you're going to have the revolution, and we end up again, with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, and there's a picture of Vladimir Lenin. There's a little painting of him over there. but he becomes the great leader of the time in Russia for a while. So there's two of the big leaders. Um, you've got Trotsky and Lenin, and the Bolshevik Party is going to come into their own in the Russian government, and they're promising peace. They're promising all kinds of stuff, but it turns out that Russia is going to be drenched with civil war for quite a while. So wait, let's get back. What about the Great War? What about World War One? What's going on with this? Well, look at this. Peace. Okay. We have the armistice on November 11th of 1918. Okay, it's the 11th month, the 11th hour, the 11th day, and all that. Let's see, yeah, 11/11/1918. So World War is over. Okay, now remember, armistice means ceasefire. And if you look at this paper here, this little clip here from it, you look down at the bottom, you see after 1,567 days, the greatest war in history ended this morning at 6 o'clock Washington time. Okay, and so on. So the armistice, ceasefire. We still have to get a treaty, remember. End of the war is getting closer and closer because, we we're going to have the armistice coming. But let's go back and talk about the last little bit of the war. Okay. The Allied counteroffensive, known as the 100 Days Offensive, started back in August of 1918, the Battle of Amiens. And this battle is going to involve more than 400 tanks, 120,000 British, French, and some other coalition troops. Okay, coalitions, the groups that come together for a common cause. And the Allies are going to make one of the greatest advances of the war in just one day. That day is called the Black Day of the German Army. Now, this is the official end, what we consider the official end of trench warfare on the Western Front. Okay, and that's in August. So here we are then, finally. Here we go with the armistice. All right. So November 11th, 1918, on 11 November at 5 a.m., an armistice with Germany was signed at 11 a.m. on 11 November 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day of the 11th month. Ceasefire comes into effect. Now, we used to always celebrate Armistice Day for a long time after that. And then eventually, what's November 11th going to be? If we were in class, I would stop and I'd say, okay, what do we call November 11th today? Well, usually somebody would pipe up, especially we're right here at Knox. I mean, somebody knows this. It's November 11th, that's Veterans Day. We changed the name of it eventually. But during the 6 hours between the actual signing of the ceasefire and it actually taking effect, you're going to have armies on, the Western Front beginning to withdraw. There's going to be some areas that they're still fighting. I mean, we don't have cell phones. We don't have immediate contact to the same extent that we do today. And we also still have some commanders that want to capture some more territory for their own glory and for their country's glory as well, really. And here we have the Big Four. Okay. Big Four, the Allies at the Paris Peace Conference. We have on the left David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. Second from the left, we have Vito Orlando, the Italian Premier. The big jolly looking guy with the moustache is Georges Clemenceau. He's French Prime Minister or Premier. And then on the right is the American President, Woodrow Wilson, who was greeted as a rock star when he came in. So World War I has ended. But it was not the war that ended all wars. Okay, because not long after World War One, we're going to have a much, much worse war starting in 1939. And the next PowerPoint, next lecture, is going to talk about, excuse me, is going to talk about the time between the wars and World War II.